What I'm going to do in this video is I'm just going to go over the very essential elements of using 3dsMax. So the first thing is this panel here. If you don't have it up, you can toggle what is called the Scene Explorer. So if I toggle from Tools, Scene Explorer, this will activate this panel. And this is very useful for seeing what we call the scene graph. Over here we have the Files menu, and this is where you can save and open up your project files, and also this is where the export dialog is for when you export into Unreal. Next thing we're going to look at is this panel over here, which is known as the command panel, which has got several tabs. This big plus tab is the create panel, and then we have the modify panel, and these are the two primary panels that you're going to have to use. There's also a hierarchy panel where we can adjust things like pivots. There's also a motion panel when we're working in animation. The display panel is fairly redundant these days, but it's where you can change the display settings. And then there's a utilities panel, which we're probably not even going to cover on this unit. So the two main panels are creating and modifying, and you'll see that in the create panel there is a bunch of standard primitives, but this is also a drop down list, so you can access things like extended primitives. The next thing we're going to do is have a little play around in this viewport and make sure that you understand how it works. So down here there's 8 icons which control the viewport, and the first one is the zoom. So if I click and drag, we will zoom in and out of the viewport. If I click this button down here, we can toggle between having a 4 layout with 4 different viewports, or having one single viewport. The next option here is the zoom mode, but this zooms all of the viewports at the same time. Then we have the zoom selection mode, and what this does is it will zoom into either the default layout, or if you've got a model built, and if I build a couple of models, it will zoom into whatever you've got selected. So at the moment I have this box. If I select the other one and zoom with the extents mode, then it will switch between those objects. The next button is the zoom extents mode, which works again. It works on all the viewports. So if I toggle this and switch between different modes, you can see that we can either focus on a specific object, and then I can switch to the other object, and you can see that it's working in all 4 viewports. Or I can switch it to an overview mode, which means that it ignores the selection and just shows everything. The next button is the field of view mode, which does not alter the camera's position, but alters the lens of the camera. This can be somewhat difficult to understand between what is the difference between zooming and changing the field of view. And we'll explain that a little bit more later on as we get into more technicalities. But just remember that normally what you will want to do is do things like zoom and panning. So the next button along the line is the pan view. Basically it allows us to click and drag. After that we've got the orbit view. If I select inside this circle, it will orbit around what I currently have selected. If I select the other object and click inside, it will orbit around. If I click outside, it will rotate or roll the camera instead. You can also do the same thing with this gizmo up here. You don't have to have this selected. So if I go into normal cursor mode, you can see that I can click on objects, but then I can just come up here and click to rotate my viewport. And then the last button on the list is the toggle maximize viewport, and that basically allows us to switch between this single view mode and full view mode. If we want to get rid of a scene, or if we just want to start afresh, one of the ways that you can do this is to go to File, Reset. If you haven't saved your work, it will come up with this warning. I don't want to save the work. And then it will warn me if I really want to reset, because this will obviously destroy my scene. Yep. And you can see that it will go away, and what it will do is it will not just remove the data in the scene, but it will reset max. And you can see that I need to bring back my tool explorer if I want that. So you may need to adjust your layout as appropriate. So now that I have a good understanding of how to navigate around the viewport, we can start by playing with putting some assets actually into the scene. So I'm on the command panel, I have my create tab open, and you can see that I have some standard primitives, and these are the objects. So if I click on box, then in the viewport it will make whatever I've got selected here, and for a box I need to click, and then I need to drag, and I need to release, and then I need to drag it again, and then I need to click one more time, and that will create a box. It'll create the box wherever you start to specify with the dragging. And you can see here the dimensions of the box. And at the moment, because this box is selected, these dimensions are actually live. So I can change the settings for this box. I can double click and type values if I want to. As you can see, I can orbit rotate around the box. I can pan, and I can zoom. So I've made myself a box, and the basics for modeling is just learning how to basically manipulate this component. And if we come up here, we can see that there are three main icons. There is a select and move, select and rotate, and then a select and uniform scale. So if I click on the first one, you will see that it will come up with a gizmo, or this is what we call this pictorial representation here. It's called a gizmo, and it shows me the X, the Y, and the Z axis, and it enables me to move along those axes. So as this is three-dimensional space and my mouse is only two-dimensional, I can only move in at most 2 dimensions at once. The arrows on the axes are context sensitive, which means if I hover over them, the axes will change color. They will go yellow, and I will be able to move on that specific axis alone. So if I select the x-axis, moving up and down doesn't do anything. Moving left to right will move the object left and right. I can do the same with the z-axis. If I click on that, you can now see I only move up and down. I can't move left and right. And again, if I come around to the other side, I can select the y-axis and move it along the y-axis. You will see that this axis corresponds to the axis down here. So that's how we can move in one axis. We can also move in two axes. If we hover between two axes, we can get this square to highlight. And now you can see I'm on the Z and the Y axis, and now I can move in two axes at the same time. And I can move around to the other two axes, so I can do ZX. And then the final third axis pair would be Y and X. So this enables me to move two axes at once. As well as that, we have a right click panel here, and we also have these values down here which correspond to the position of this object. So I can reset these values by right clicking, and you will see that the object will move along that corresponding axis. So if I set my X value to 20, you can see that it moves to the corresponding X axis. If I set it to 0, it will move back to the origin. We call the point where all these values are 0 the origin. So if I right click on this button, it will bring up this transform typing panel, and you can see again what I can do is I can change the X value, same as doing down here. So this would be an absolute world position, so I can set it to 20 or minus 20. Let's set that to 20. And then there's an offset value, so I could move it minus 10 and then minus 10 again, and it will be back at the origin. So this panel is quite useful. You can do the same thing down here with this as toggles between an absolute position and an offset position. So if I set this to 10, it will move it by 10. If I set it to 10 again, it will move it by 10. And if I set it to 10 again, it will move it by another 10. Obviously, if I add a 0 in, it will do nothing. If I then want to go back to world space, you can see that I need to set this to 0. There is one final part to this gizmo, and that is this little square here. And what this does is it moves along in what we call screen space, which is in accordance with the view. So if I move this here and I move it up and down, it moves along the plane of the screen. And it's quite hard to visualize this, because as I move this around, you can see that this plane will always remain in the same space. So to better illustrate this, what I will do is I will make a copy of this object, and you can see how they shift in relation to one another. So if I just shift and drag, I will get another copy of this object, and I'm just going to change its color so that you can see the difference between them. So you can see, obviously, if I move this in the X, they're going to intersect. And then if I move them in the Y, you can see how you can see that one object's in front of the other. Now, if I move it like this, you can see how it's changing its relationship in accordance. And you really have to practice with this to try and understand the way it moves in space, because it can be quite difficult to appreciate when you're watching it. It may not seem particularly useful for you at the beginning, because it seems like a fairly abstract, but when you're working on more organic shapes, or when you become very familiar with the way that the tool works, you may find it very preferential. I use the inner selection extensively, and you can force it to use this inner selection by going from the view mode to what they call screen mode, and now my XY axis is going to be always parallel to the screen. So if I rotate this around, you'll see that the axis snaps back to X and Y, X being left and right and Y being up and down. And Z is actually in and out of the screen. Okay. So let's put this back on the origin. I'm going to put my gizmo back into view mode. And there's one more point that I need to explain, but first of all, I'll just show you the rotate, and then we can come back to the move tool. So if I rotate, you can see the gizmo changes to this kind of ball, and now I have again 3 similar axes, but now they're all arcs, and I can rotate around the Z axis, I can rotate around the X axis, and I can rotate around the y-axis. And if I just click on no particular line whatsoever, I can try and rotate around all 3 axes at the same time. Again, down here you can see these values. These relate to the rotation values for each axis. So if I want to change the z-axis, I can use the spinner. I can go in and type a particular angle, and this will rotate in accordance with these settings. Now if I go back into my move mode, you can see that even though I've rotated the object, the axis is still aligned to this core axis, this main axis. X is still along this x-axis. We call this world space because it relates to the world, and in fact Max labels this particular a view space because it depends on which viewport you're using. If I switch this to world space, you'll see that the axis doesn't change because in this particular view, in perspective, world and view are exactly the same thing. The other axis system that I can use is called local, and you will see now that the axis is now aligned to the object, and that as I rotate the object, so the axis alignment changes with the object. So when you're trying to move things along their primer axes, you probably want to be in local mode, not in world mode. And this is most important if you ever try and do some animation. You need to make sure that you're animating in local space, not in world space, because when we're animating, we're going to be dealing with a lot of hierarchies. And the final of these trifecta of tools is the scale tool. So again, what we have is 3 axes. We can scale it in X and Y and Z. You'll notice that if I do this, I start to lose the orthogonal nature of this original cube because I've rotated it and then I've scaled it along the y-axis. For this reason, we tend to avoid what we call non-uniform scale. That is, we tend to avoid scaling along one particular axis. If I want to reset the scale, strangely, Max uses a percentage relationship for scale, so I'm going to have to set this back to 100, and that will have all of the values set to 100, and so we have no scale on this object, or rather we have what we call uniform scale on the object. We ideally do not want to do any scaling. This can seem like a very arbitrary rule at the beginning of this process. I'm not going to worry too much about people scaling in this unit, or probably even in the first year, but you will almost certainly come across problems that are due to scaling, and it's just a good habit to get into, is rather than scaling, if you're dealing with primitives, to actually change the specific values of the primitive, rather than actually being tempted to go in and do a scale. Because you can see now, if I change this Z scale, you can see that the height of this object isn't changing. So now that we've understood the fundamentals about moving, rotating and scaling, and that we know how to access these objects here, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to do some practice work. So the first thing is I want you to build an angle poise lamp, and I'm going to show you how to do that. It's going to be a very simple design, but it's just a practice piece in using primitives, moving and rotating them around. So I'm going to make the base of this angle poise lamp, and to begin with, there's a few settings that we need to play around with over here. So if I change these height settings, we can't really see any change in the geometry, and we can't see any change in the silhouette. Whereas if I change the number of sides, you can see it makes a drastic impression on the object's complexity. So if I have 6 sides on an object, on a cylinder, you can see that this will look more like a hexagonal nut because we have a very low representation of the surface. And if I change this up to 60, you can see that we have a very smooth representation. And the only reason that we have a smooth representation is because it is literally made out of tiny straight edges. Now, whilst I can change the number of sides of this object in this mode while I'm still in the create panel, what will happen is if I click off this object and then click back on this object, I lose these settings, and that's because it's changed from being a live object to being one that needs to be modified. So if I switch to this modifier panel, you can see that here are those settings again. There's my 6 sides. I'm going to change that to 12. And again, you can see that I've got my height segments and nothing seems to be happening when I change it. So I want to do is I want to change my display so that I can see what we call a wireframe. I can see the geometric representation of this object. So I'm going to switch from default shading to edged faces. And you can also do this by pressing F4 on the keyboard. And this will show your geometry as what we call wireframes, which are lines that join the vertices together. And now if I change my height segments, you can see that we're adding in extra geometry. Again, one of the things about game engines and about game artists is that you need to be somewhat concerned about extra geometry and optimization. But we will only concern ourselves with that once you get to a point where artistically you're demonstrating all the aesthetic skills, and then we will start to transition you to understanding how we will optimize for game-ready performance. So anyway, going back to our angle poise lamp, you can see that what I will want to do is I would just want to thin this down a little bit because it is the base of the lamp. And let's change that number of sides to 24, make it a little bit rounder. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this object is on the origin. So I'm going to reset. I'm going to right click on these arrows, and that will set those values to 0. And now I know that my model is on the origin and that it's not moved somewhere in space. You don't need to do this, but again, it's good practice when you come to moving things in and out of different authoring tools like 3dsMax and Blender. It tends to be good practice to make sure that you at least know where things are, even if they aren't necessarily on the origin. And it's usually quite easy to remember if something's on the origin, rather than to say, oh yeah, this thing's 10 up in the Z and 4 across in the X and 3.798 across in the Y axis. That stuff tends to get a bit messy. So, okay, so we have built ourselves the base of our angle poise lamp. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a box. So I'm just going to make this off to one side. This is basically going to be the first armature in the linkage to this angle poise lamp, which is basically going to have 2 armatures and a cone. So what I will do is I will reset this back onto the origin. So I know now that this is exactly in the center of the base. The next thing I'm going to do while I remember is to rename things. This is going to be my base, and this is going to be my arm 01. Naming conventions are important. Once you get into the second year and you're dealing with much more complicated scenes, you don't want 100 boxes and then you're trying to figure out which one is a leg and which one is an eyeball. Right, okay, so I'm just going to move this up Z so that it's above our base. Then the next thing is I want another armature, and for that I'm going to hold the shift key down and I'm going to drag this up, and that will bring up a dialog and said, okay, you want another object. There are some options here, we will cover that in more detail, but to begin with we're just going to go with copy, and we're going to have this called arm2. Okay, now if I don't want to do it that way, there is also the option, if you right click, so if you go over an object and you right click, it comes up with what is called a quad menu, even though there's only two parts to it at the moment. And there's a clone, and again it will bring up the same dialog, and I will click OK, and then I can move it afterwards. Depends on your preference, but I'm pretty sure you'll get used to using the keyboard shortcuts quite quickly. So I have my two arm components. I'm just going to change the color of the second one by clicking on this swatch. So I'm going to make sure I'm in the modifies panel. I'm going to go to the swatch color. This will bring up a dialog, and I'm just going to change this to the blue. So I now have three pieces of my angle poise lamp, and what I'm going to do now is that I know, because I want this to be a different shape, I'm just going to rotate things around and practice moving again. So this is going to be over here. I want to move this into position, so I'm going to move along this axis, and then I'm going to rotate it again, and then finally I want to build the head of the lamp. So I'm going to go back to my create menu. I'm going to use a cone this time, and I'm going to click and drag to make a cone. Note that I've kept the narrow part of the cone at the bottom, and you may appreciate this in a little bit when I show you what happens when we move the head of the cone. Again, if I go to my modifies panel, we can change the height, we can change the number of height segments, and we can change the number of sides, and I'm quite happy with 24, but for the sake of it I'm going to change it down to 20. And then again, what I'm going to do is move it. I'm going to set it to the origin, and then I'm going to move it up in the Z, and then move it over in the X-axis. So I know that all of these objects are nicely aligned along the Y-axis. And then finally I'm going to go into rotate, and I'm going to rotate this head so that we have it correctly aligned. Check your lamp and make sure that everything's in the right place. Save your work, because I'm going to want to see it. Once you've completed the lamp, then feel free to do something a little bit more experimental, or maybe do something a bit more creative. This is an opportunity for you to show what you're capable of, and to think about the kind of things that you feel comfortable demonstrating. And this will help me to understand where you are, so that I can ensure that you're getting the right materials. Everything has to be a little bit challenging, but not too challenging. In the next stage, we are going to be looking at something called editable poly, and this will allow you to change the actual geometry of these individual objects, and that is when we will get into the more technical area of how game art production is actually done.